Good evening, everyone. I just want to thank you for joining us tonight on this beautiful, lovely afternoon. It looked stormier earlier, and now it's clearing up, and I think we're going to have a great sunset. I am Robert Lance. I am the president of the Denver Council on Foreign Relations. I would like to welcome all of you to a very special presentation tonight, and I hope that you've all had a chance to have some snacks upstairs and maybe a drink or two. I want to, first of all, thank, where I don't see him, but where's George Sparks? There. Front row. But I'd like to thank George Sparks. He's a DCFR board member, and he's also the president of this institution here and the CEO, and he has been a great contribution not only to the DCFR, but I guess more importantly to the community, and if you know a little bit about this organization here, the world. So it's not an unimportant statement that we've had a great impact because of you in this world. So thank you. As most of our members know, we don't regularly hold these meetings in the summer, and that's why I'm probably sweating. But tonight we are very excited to welcome Matthew Rojanski tonight. And he's going to speak with our very own chair of the board, who's standing back there, and I'll introduce in a moment. He is the dean of Korbel School at Fritz Mayr, and I thank them for coming here to speak tonight. Before we begin, though, I have something very important, some very important business for this organization that I wanted to just tell you about. Let me tell you a little bit about our executive director. Our executive director is stepping down, not immediately, but soon. And her name is Katie Kaplan. She's standing over there now looking at me with a grimace. But for those of you who don't know, Katie came on board with us in about 2019. And Katie and I both kind of took our positions at the time that none of us expected would happen, which was March of 2020. And what many of you may not know is in March of 2020, there were some critical decisions made that allowed this organization to go on. One of those was, despite our now new hatred of it, we decided to do some of our meetings by Zoom. And quite frankly, I think that saved this organization, as I've seen others in this community that have gone away because of their inability to meet. Part of that inspiration and part of that structure was created by Katie. And I don't know if you all know, but Katie has been behind the scenes suffering with the technology early on when we were all figuring out how to press buttons and to mute and to not mute and to answer questions in an appropriate way. I think the very first meeting that we had with Andrew Rojanski, and he was running for Senate. And if many of you recall, it was our first foray into this when we didn't realize there was a mute button, and some of us were greeting each other during his speech. But we survived that, we moved on, and in many ways, we wouldn't have been able to do so without Katie. I just feel fortunate to have worked with her the last few years, and tonight I just want to give her something as a token of our appreciation from both the board, from the executive committee, and from me and the members. If you could come up here. And George, we always hand out awards whenever we're in your place. But I'd like to thank you for all of your service. Here's a correction that's going to be made. We'll fix that. But anyway, I just thank you for all your years of service. It's been fun to work with you. We've laughed through the tears. We've laughed through the frustrations of technology and everything else. But thank you so much for everything you've done for the organization. And I will always remember you and thank you for all you've done. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So now on to the program. I want to make sure that we have plenty of time for the speakers, and that's why we actually started a little bit earlier than I anticipated. But first of all, we've got a lot to cover tonight. The issues are for that matter, not unimportant. They're very important in the world, very critical today. And we have probably some of the best talking point speakers right now going to present tonight. We've been fortunate enough to have Fritz be the chair of the Denver Council on Foreign Relations, I believe, for the last 2 years. Fritz Mayer has been, as you know, the dean at the Joseph Corbell School of International Studies at University of Denver. Previously, he was professor of public policy at Duke University's Sanford School of Public Policy and a professor of political science and environment. He teaches courses on political economy of public policy, globalization and governance, political analysis, and leadership. I can't even go into all of the details of his resume, but he is an incredible powerhouse at Corbell, and the reputation of Corbell is known around the world. Our other speaker tonight, and most importantly, Matthew Rojanski is going to be speaking with us tonight. He is President and Chief Executive Officer for the U.S.-Russia Foundation. Prior to this, he served as director of the Keenan Institute, the premier U.S. Center for Advanced Research on Russia and Eurasia. Mr. Rojanski is among the most widely recognized and cited experts on Russia, and he has published works on the history and practice of U.S.-Russian relations, bilateral exchanges, and the rule of law, which some of us were talking tonight seems to be missing in Russia right now, unfortunately. He also serves as the U.S. Executive Secretary for the Dartmouth Conference, a Track 2 U.S.-Russian conflict resolution initiative begun in 1960. He has lectured at colleges and universities throughout the United States, Russia, and Europe. He is counselor to the Cooperative Security Initiative, the Aspen Institute Congressional Program, and the Euro-Atlantic Security Leaders Group. Previously, Mr. Rojanski was Deputy Director of the Russia and Eurasia Program at Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and Executive Director of the Partnership for Secure America. He has also served as an embassy policy specialist at the U.S. Embassy in Kyiv, Ukraine, a visiting scholar in the research division at NATO Defense College, and a clerk to Judge Charles E. Erdman on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Armed Services. He received his BA in history from Harvard and his JD from Stanford Law School. I think it is safe to say that he knows a little bit about the subject we're going to be talking about tonight. And I thank him so much for making his way out here. Fortunately, Steamboat and the mountains have much to offer, so we are blessed to have him here for this occasion. So without further ado, I will have them come up.
Well, great to see all of you. I know you're all in the sun there baking, so it will pass, I guess, in time. Thanks so much, Rob, for the introduction. Katie, my thanks as well for all you've done. George, thank you for hosting us. What a beautiful, it's a pretty nice spot, isn't it? Yeah, it's like the best view in the city. Yeah. George was telling me he has an inside office with no window, but he has a camera that gives a constant feed on a big screen TV of that view. So it's not all bad. Well, it's such a treat to be able to talk this evening with Matt. As Rob said, the truth is there are very few people in the world who have more insight and more to share, I think, about what's happening. Not just historically, but at the current moment in Ukraine and with Russia. So we thought we'd just jump right in to what is going on. He knows, we can talk about the history and how we got there and what led to the invasion. But let's just start with the headlines, Matt. Odessa, which had sort of escaped punishment to some extent for a long time, the collapse of the grain deal, Russia's actions there. What do you make of this? Is this I saw that they bombed as well on the Danube, and so now, so there's concern. Is this what do you make of this in terms of escalation and the trajectory of this war?
Well, first of all, thank you, Fritz. Thank you, Rob, for the generous introduction, proving I cannot keep a job. And thank you to Katie and the board of the DCFR. I'm very glad you all survived the pandemic so that I had a chance to come out. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention someone who had been working on making that happen for a year, but couldn't be with us tonight, Judge Sid Brooks, who serves on the Rule of Law Committee at the U.S.-Russia Foundation. Sorry that he couldn't be with us tonight, but I know he would approve of getting right to it. So no further delay. Look, I make it a point never to read Putin's mind, or for that matter, any other leader, because I just know we get it wrong over and over and over. So, for example, I was dead certain that he would not invade in the way that he did. The main reason was because it was a stupid thing to do, and I don't think Putin's a stupid man. And I think that the playbook that he showed us over nearly a quarter century was to have a relatively weak hand compared to whatever adversary, the West, China, and to play it very skillfully. And he did not do that here, and that was very clear. It was clear to those of us who know Ukraine. Ukrainians would fight, and 100,000, 150,000, 200,000 Russian troops were never going to be enough to occupy the biggest country in Europe if it didn't want to be occupied. So, and part of why I'm giving you this background is because I think it continues to inform his thinking. I think he had fundamentally bad information about what Ukraine is in 2022 and 2023 that doesn't just come from some Soviet-era hangover, that comes from his having isolated himself during the pandemic, that comes from him not reading news. He doesn't go on the internet. He does not use the internet, right? He relies entirely on face-to-face intelligence briefings, and he lets a very small number of people near him to give him those. And so I think he shaped a reality that, at least in February, March of 2022, to him seemed plausible but was patently false. Now, he's been smacked in the face by the reality of the last year and a half. And part of that is the Ukrainians fought successfully. They rolled the Russian army back in many places. And now the Ukrainians are even striking inside of Russia, right, to get to today's news. So what does Vladimir Putin do if he has a fundamental misconception about this country that he's dealing with, and he has a number of fundamentally strongly held views about the West, which we can talk about in a few moments? What does he do to change the trajectory of this fight? My view of it is he's trying to wait us out. And I think part of that is making this as painful as possible in a way that he can sustain for as long as possible. And the evidence of that is that the Russians, in fact, haven't escalated. I know it's ironic relative to the question. What they're doing is barbaric, right? The slaughter is unacceptable. And yet there are so many other things that if Putin wanted to make this an apocalyptic conflict that brought all of Russia's resources to bear, that he hasn't done yet. And the question is why? And I think it has to be because thus far, again, not trying to read his mind, but thus far, just looking at the strategy, he doesn't need to. He just needs to keep the fight going long enough that the pain that it's causing us, the pain that it's causing Europe, and most of all the pain that it's causing Ukrainians, in his view, not in their view, but in his view, will be too much and they'll give up and they'll roll over.
Yeah. Well, it seems, so the interesting question then is why does he make this mistake? So he seems to have made a couple of mistakes. One was, as you just said, completely misunderstanding his own capabilities and anticipating that Ukraine, would be a pretty easy target, I guess, and I suppose people were telling him that. And the other, and I guess the jury's still out on this, is whether he can wait out the West. I mean, a lot of commentary, of course, that he did not expect what has happened, which is Sweden and Finland joining NATO, and to this point at least, the West rallying and strengthening. So coming back, I know we're not reading his mind, but why does he make these mistakes? One is that he's really getting poor information, and then the question is why does that happen? But is this the fundamental weakness of an autocrat who makes mistakes because he's so isolated from reality. What is, how do you make these kind of these are historical mistakes, right?
I mean, so the unsatisfying answer is that two things are true at the same time. On the one hand, Putin has always been very opportunistic. That's what I meant by being dealt a bad hand, playing it well, and coming out on top, whatever that situation might be. And there are recent examples of that, right? I mean, Syria was an amazing case. Relatively small investment. He completely upended the politics of the Middle East, right? Where the Prime Minister of Israel has got to go to Moscow to ask permission, right, to defend Israeli airspace, right? A total transformation. But at the same time, I think one thing that has occurred more and more in the last 10 to 15 years, so remember, this is a guy who was basically elected free and fair the first time around. Yeltsin gave him a huge leg up by anointing him. But he's elected in 2000, basically in a free and fair election, and then never again after that. And so as one after another term as the supreme leader of an increasingly powerful and increasingly confident country as it recovers economically and militarily from the Soviet collapse, of these unelected authoritarian terms stack up, I think you increasingly have a guy who believes his own narrative about himself. Again, I don't know that that's what is in his head, but I do know what he says and what he writes. And much, much more today than 20 years ago, he talks about the grand themes of Russia in history, Russia's place in the world, right? The natural space that Russia should occupy on the Eurasian landmass. So when you have a narrative like that, you might be totally opportunistic and very effective at playing a hand. You might be good at bluffing and all those intelligence officer adaptability skills. And I think he still has those. That's still true. So we can't count him out as an out-to-lunch autocrat who doesn't get it and is living, in a fantasy world. But at the same time, he has built this fantasy. And I think that is why he has made this conflict with Ukraine, which by many measures he can't win, also one he can't afford to lose. It's the central narrative for his regime.
Yeah. I warned you that I would ask you to choose between John Mearsheimer and Fiona Hill in terms of interpreting, but I had the opportunity to, not Mearsheimer, but Fiona and I had a conversation, and of course she very much believes and thinks as a historian in that fantasy that he seems to hold, and again, without getting in his mind, that's what he says. I mean, he expects himself to be that third or fourth bust in the Hall of the Pantheon of Heroes. Where is that your? Again, it's complicated. Mearsheimer, on the other hand, I'm sure you all know, sort of the realist school. This is NATO expansion that triggered this inevitable. What did we expect? And almost blaming, or coming very close to blaming, the West for what happened. What's your take on his motives for doing this? You thought he wouldn't do it. I thought he wouldn't do it, but he did.
And again, let me be really clear. The reason I thought he wouldn't do it was I thought he was rational. I thought he was rational, and I knew that this was an irrational thing to do. A rational thing to do, by the way, not a good or correct thing to do in a moral sense, but a rational thing to do would have been to build up 100, 200,000 troops on the Ukrainian border and basically extract as much of a concession as he possibly could from Ukraine and from the United States and NATO. And actually, to be honest, in November and December and even January of last year and the year before, it pretty much looked like that was what was going to happen. So that's why I was very skeptical of U.S. government claims saying, no, he's going for it. And my colleagues who know, they read satellite photos really well, and they say, this is what it looks like when there's going to be an invasion. And I was like, no, he's getting everything he wants, and he's getting it on a silver platter. He'd have to be an idiot. And I couldn't believe that. And so, all this time since, I think, has opened the envelope of the possible, the Overton window, whatever you want to call it, for what we have to imagine that not only Putin, but any leader, right, think Xi Jinping, might be capable of doing against his own self-interest. And that's really the tricky thing here, is we can't apply this lens of rationality that would make sense to you or me.
No, I agree. As it happened, I had breakfast this morning with Madeline Albrights' daughter, and so on the eve of war, she predicted that this would happen. So maybe there's something about having lived through the craziness of another time where you recognize the madness that's possible.
One point there, you remind me of something I think incredibly important that a Russian colleague, Ukrainian colleague is saying, which is, in order to fight and win this war, we must hate. But in order to rebuild our country, we must not hate forever. And what that reminds me of is the experience of a Madeline Albright, the experience of the leaders of the Baltic countries or Poland, all of whom, every one of them. You know, I don't think it's Fiona on one side and Mearsheimer on the other. I think it's Eastern Europe on one side and, you know, Western Europe or Southern Europe on the other, right? That's the real dichotomy. And of course the Eastern Europeans, having lived through Soviet occupation, were certain that he would do this. The problem is they were certain he would do it 20 years ago, and he didn't. And we had 20 years of prosperity, and we lifted countries up from poverty. And so, again, this is not disagreeing with Madeline Albright's prediction. She was absolutely right. But we also have to get to that future when we don't hate and we don't expect horrors every day from our neighbor. We have to be able to get to a different place in European security.
Well, I absolutely want to come to your thoughts about the future and the possibilities of getting beyond the moment. But let me ask you about Putin's status. You know, you said, I mean, he seemed so skillful. He played a weak hand extremely well. He projected that to the Russian people. At least from afar, it seemed like he was immensely competent and also incredibly secure. You know? And then we have this Wagner mutiny and Prigozhin. What's your take on his how precarious his hold of power is? That whole episode. I mean, what do you make of that?
So there are a couple of like premises that you all have to understand. Number one is, polling in authoritarian countries is what it is, right? So you say, hello, is this Mrs. Ivanova? Yes. What do you think of the leader, right? Like, what do you think the answer is going to be? That said, we've known that for a while, and so there are some pretty good statistical techniques that can be used to discount that, and so fairly reliable polls indicate that he hovers between 60 and 70%, and that's been pretty consistent. He did get a spike after the beginning of the invasion, classic rally around the flag effect, but that tells you that basically most of the Russian people have very little source of information other than state television, which is controlled by the Kremlin. And that they don't see an alternative. And in part, they don't see an alternative because they buy the state propaganda narrative, which is we're surrounded by enemies. Why would we pick some namby-pamby, weak, liberal, pro-Western, opposition person? We need to be led by a strong man on horseback, and that's clearly, or bareback, that's Putin, right? But in part, it's because Putin has been incredibly effective at eliminating alternatives, right? Have you noticed Navalny's sitting in jail, right? Have you noticed that he's knocked off like about a dozen other potential, not even rivals for power, but just people who, empower alternative futures. And by the way, I mean, he's increasingly widened the window of who he's willing to take on now to include not just Russians. It used to be the rule was they'd go after Russians, but not Westerners. But now he's arresting Westerners. He's putting people like me on his sanctions list. Why? Because of the work we do in the U.S.-Russia Foundation, right? So he is this is the thing he thinks about, I think, way more than the war in Ukraine, which is, of course, foolish of him, because if he loses the war in Ukraine, it is probably true that his regime will start to spin apart. But, that prediction is worth exactly what you paid for it. I don't know for sure. But I think he thinks every morning, every day when he wakes up, I think he thinks about the strength of his regime and who does he have to eliminate and control. And so that leads to the Prigozhin question. How did this possibly happen? How could this have happened? Here's the reality. The Russian system, unlike the Soviet system, right? Putin's Russian system, unlike the Soviet system, is not institutionalized. It is highly personalized, right? So he carries all the legacies of the Soviet experience, and that's a common ground that he has with men of his generation, right? Who are, increasingly older, right? They're now in their 60s and 70s. The younger generation doesn't have that common experience. Their window of possibility, is quite different. And so he relies on people who he cannot always understand and he cannot always control. And Prigozhin's not the only example of that. There's also Kadyrov, the dictator of Chechnya, who has his own private army of 30 to 60,000 armed men, heavy weapons, air defenses, and has literally said, if you send federal security forces to Chechnya, we will kill them, right? So he's relying on all kinds of people that he cannot possibly control, and the only reason that they haven't toppled him thus far is because they're all fighting one another at the same time. And he's been a master of, as I said, that opportunistic, that KGB, counterintelligence kind of manipulation. But that can't last forever.
Let me ask you, I started with this, but I'll come back to it. Just to ask you to do what is, of course, impossible, which is predict what's going to happen in this war. But I'm going to ask you what's going to happen in this war. What is your takeaway as to where we are in this? I mean, as you said, Putin's strategy, is to delay, to wait this out, among other things, in hopes that the resolve of the West fades over time. Obviously, now Ukraine was extraordinary and heroic and inspiring on defense, but offense is a different matter, and they seem to be they're making slow progress, etc. We all follow that. What is your assessment about what is, as best you can, and what is likely to happen over the next six months or a year here?
Okay, so I can tell you some things that probably won't happen. The Ukrainians won't stop fighting. They won't surrender. I think it's very, very unlikely that Zelensky will sign any kind of agreement that gives up claims on Ukrainian territory. Yeah, because by the way, if he does, even if he wanted to do that, he's gone.
Do it, right?
This is not about Zelensky. It's about where.
No, that's impossible.
Right. So.
And Putin can't back down either.
That's right. That's right. I don't think Putin will back down either. So that leaves us in a situation where if we have to try to handicap scenarios, look, I mean, I could tell you this war is going to go on, but you know that, right? I mean, you've been watching this for a year and a half, and you can see it hasn't slowed. So what we have to do is try to handicap scenarios that either change the course of the war, like a major counteroffensive or a major new Russian offensive, or escalation to widen the war, which is not impossible, right? We should probably talk a bit about that as well. Or some type of settlement. And again, I think we both accurately said neither the Russians nor the Ukrainians are going to give up their claims on territory. So what that would leave us with is something like North-South Korea armistice, where basically both sides are exhausted. They don't agree with the other side's territorial claims, but they need to focus on rebuilding at home and need to, slow the fighting down. The problem, I should add, the problem with that is it has never worked in the post-Soviet space. And the proof of that is Armenia and Azerbaijan, who after 25 years of a lull just started fighting again 2 years ago, and a massive amount of territory changed hands.
Yeah, which of course disheartening to imagine the ultimate outcome is that they just fight to exhaustion, the loss of life, the consequences, and so we're not looking at anything in the next 3 months, 6 months, year, and so that does bring back the question of the resolve of the West, and whether, I don't know how closely I'm sure you follow, Intrigues in Washington and elsewhere pretty closely, or in Germany, or you see, they're crap. I mean, Hungary's never been quiet fully on board. Do you worry about, particularly depending, I suppose, on the outcome of our next election, that Putin may actually have the last laugh here?
So somebody asked me a version of this question the other day in Steamboat, and it sort of caused me to pause and think. Yes, intrigues in Washington, intrigues in Europe, all about them. I think what I've come to realize is that we in the West are in an incredibly strong position right now, but in part it's because it's not really being tested. It's not being tested in the sense that the countries that have recently joined NATO are basically countries that everybody understood were aligned with NATO to begin with. So actually, meaningful lines on the map haven't changed that much. You know, Dmitry Medvedev, the former president, and now, you know, sort of Putin's understudy on the Security Council, is constantly rattling the saber about, we should use nukes, we should use nukes, we should use nukes, and yet there's really no indication that the Russians would ever seriously contemplate doing that, and certainly not against a NATO country, right? And same, you know, they've argued we should bomb the supply lines in Poland going into Ukraine because after all, it's an act of war to supply lethal weapons to an adversary in war, so we have every right to bomb. And yet, any real indication that that's, no, not really. And so the moment, so all of this, so where is Turkey, where is Hungary, you know, internal debates in Germany, internal debates in our own country, can exist in the realm of domestic politics. And the realm of domestic politics is imagination land, right? It's make your enemy look bad, make you look tough, claim you're gonna do all these things, you know, easy answers, go peddling, kind of simple one sentence solutions. And you know, how many of us have ever heard a politician promise something that they then literally didn't do anything about when they were in office, right? Yeah. So all of this debate and all of this division hasn't come home to roost because it hasn't been tested. And so what I worry about is not so much that we are weak. I think we're incredibly strong right now. I just actually don't want to see our position tested. Because I think when it's tested is when we are going to have to resolve these very, very hard internal issues.
What tests it? What?
I think a test would be if the Russians actually did cross a line. If, for example, there's no reason. I mean, again, here I am predicting what would be rational for Putin to do. There's no reason for Putin to go after an additional new chunk of territory somewhere in the Baltic Sea. He doesn't care about that, right? His narrative, it's about Ukraine. He's got to win in Ukraine. So what can he do to make it easier for him to win in Ukraine? He can intimidate the West out of continuing to supply weapons. How do you do that? You knock off some of the key people involved in supplying weapons. You take out the actual supply lines of weapons, right? Do things in a deniable way. Do them through cyber attacks, right? The more that he kind of slices the sausage or, you know, sort of gradually boils the frog in those areas, I think the more all the noise in and around the debates that you and I just signposted is going to get louder and louder and louder. And one thing that I suspect is present in the minds of Russians, or certainly I know is in the discourse among Russians, is the example of Afghanistan, right? The Taliban, you know, were on their heels for a while, but they just kept up the pressure, they kept fighting, and they exhausted us, right? That's the Russian narrative, and might not be wrong. And, you know, maybe it'll take 20 years, but they've got 20 years. This is next door. This will always be next door. Do we have 20 years?
I think no, that's right. You know, Zelensky, you know, speaks all the time. Always, you know, we need more weapons. We need more munitions. The U.S. it says no, 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 yes, no, 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 yes, no, 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 yes, over and over again. And you know, one interpretation of that is that we've just given them just enough to hold on, but not enough to win. That would be maybe Zelensky's. You know, should we just say yes? I mean, you know, that's always in a way the corollary to the point you just made, which is the temptation of Putin to escalate in subtle ways. So what do you make of the pattern of our willingness to arm? The hesitancy, the fear initially that maybe in the shadow of a nuke threat, maybe I don't know what was, you know, holding us back, other concerns, but are we just giving enough to ensure that this darn thing goes on forever?
I mean, so I want to give credit to this administration. They have been masterful at, you know, escalation, essentially, at measured, gradual escalation. I would have never in a million years, if you'd asked me a year and a half ago, said that Abrams tanks would be going to Ukraine. And now, given what we've seen, it probably is not unreasonable to think that, you know, fifth-generation fighter aircraft will at some point, you know, that maybe Ukrainians are being trained on them now. And actually, that kind of brings me to the point I wanted to make, which is, you know, all is not quite what it appears here. I think there's a lot of Kabuki theater involved. I think when the United States says, no, we won't do this, we'll never do this, this is off the table, we're not considering it, There definitely are people considering it, like official people, and they're writing memos about exactly how it would work, and they've got it queued up, and they're basically ready to go, if not going already, right? And often what happens is we only hear about a debate as a debate after it's already been settled and it's happening on the ground. And I think that's part of the masterful management of this staged escalation, which has caught the Russians flat-footed. I think the way that we have used information and communicated has, for the first time, massively outplayed the Russian side, who historically have outplayed us in information control. The other side of the Kabuki equation is this story about, you know, who can produce what and how effective and for how long, right? Like we somehow are in this different, you know, post-Cold War era where we just can't produce enough stuff to fight the Russians. Like, I'm not telling you that that's wrong. There's enough truth to that it's a, you know, fair point to make. But obviously, if we genuinely thought that, you know, the fight for NATO is right there between Ukraine and Russia, we could take all this stuff that's sitting with, what, 35 armies all across Europe that, you know, who's Portugal defending us from right now? I mean, I'm not trying to pick on, I'm simply saying, like, if we wanted to direct a bunch of stuff, right? So there's a lot of Kabuki to that. But I think that the point that we don't want to create a situation where this war necessarily expands out of control is a really valid point, because at the end of the day, if the Russians are losing badly enough, they have a doomsday weapon. I'm talking about nukes. Obviously.
Yeah, that got everyone's attention. Let me. We could talk on about the progress of the war, and of course it's you know pure speculation where this ends. It will end at some point, and let's just stick with the scenario you gave us, which was exhaustion, a grudging agreement, some line of demarcation. Maybe Ukraine gets back the Donbass, but gives up Crimea. There's some line. I'm just curious. I mean, your U.S.-Russia, relations. We have a pattern of war crimes. We have incredible devastation in Ukraine. There'll be, this is not going to go away soon. As you look, around the future, is there a way back for U.S.-Russia relations, short of a regime change in Russia? If Putin's still in power, barely holding on, there's some kind of, are we in for a very, very long, second Cold War, in terms of U.S.-Russia relations?
Yeah, I mean, so I basically agree with the premise, the implied premise. There's not a way back as long as Vladimir Putin rules Russia. The harder question, given that Putin is, one thing we know about him for sure is he will die. He's a mortal man, right? And by the way, I don't go for the counting liver spots and, he's got a body double and all this, look at his ear and he's a basically healthy man. If you see him out in public, it's probably him, and he's probably functional, and he may have cancer, but lots of people live for a long time with cancer, and if you're Vladimir Putin, you can do a lot of harm while still fighting cancer. So he could be around for quite a while, but he won't be around forever. And so the harder question is, how do we get from that moment where there is no more Putin, but there still is a Putin system in Russia, there's maybe still a Russian army that's occupying parts of Ukraine and Georgia, there still is a whole set of relationships dominating Belarus and Kazakhstan and all of the former Soviet space. And don't forget, there's a Russian population of 145 million people who, hopefully this time around we get the memo, because I don't think we did 30 years ago, don't want to be told you lost, so too bad, you're going to do what we say, because that's how Putin ended up in power. That's why we ended up with a resentful, angry, anti-Western Russian population today, because they were told you lost, and so we get to set the rules of the international system. I'm not saying it's our fault, but let's not repeat that same mistake as we go about insisting on accountability for Putin and the people behind this war and the war crimes, which we have to do in a post-Putin world, but we have to do it really, really carefully.
So your mic seems to be cutting out. We may have to share this one. I'm tempted to go back a bit in history just for a moment, because you opened that up a little bit, and following collapse of the Soviet Union, Gorbachev, Glasnost and Perestroika, even Yeltsin, even initially Putin. It seemed like there was, you get to join our club, and we were going to all be friends. And from that period of, we're obviously at, it's gone, I don't know, steadily, but, in steps, worse and worse. Always impossible, the counterfactual in history, but did it have to go that way? Was it ever possible that Russia would be, I even broached at one point, part of NATO, part of Western Europe in some sense, or was there something? Is there something inevitable, structural here that made this inevitable?
That is a great and really interesting question. The tragedy of it is that since the answer is, of course it wasn't inevitable, of course we could have made different choices, and they could have made different choices, we can't go back now and change them. But let me offer you a couple of inflection points where I do think we could have done some things differently. I think in the 1990s, we made a big mistake betting on Boris Yeltsin, the man. I had no problem with the idea that Yeltsin was the best of a bad lot. But the problem was, if our narrative is that we stand for democracy and process, rule of law, the free market, and so on, when Yeltsin himself became more authoritarian, when he was at 3% in the polls in 1996 and had no chance of beating his communist opponent, and we came in with international financial institution lending billions of dollars that enabled him to basically buy the goodwill of the Russian people, or even basically threaten them and say, like, look, if you want to get paid, you'd better vote for me because the Americans won't fund a communist government of Russia. I think it was a huge mistake because we undermined the idea of process and rule of law. And that, at the end of the day, is the only protection that anyone other than a warlord has, right? There's always someone with more guns than you. That's as true in Russia as it is here, in the Western United States, right? There's always someone with more power who's willing to use it to take what you have. And so you have to build institutions and rules and laws, and you have to respect them. And I think walking that walk has been very, very hard for us in a lot of places. That was the sort of original sin of Russia. And of course, you have to follow that thought through and say, well, okay, what if a communist had won the election in 1996? Yeah, there would have been a lot of anti-American rhetoric, but it's entirely possible that he would have then lost in the election of 2000. And we'd have had 3 peaceful democratic transitions of power in Russia instead of 1, which ended in Vladimir Putin, right? So I do think that we bear some responsibility for that. Obviously, the Russian leadership at the time certainly does, the oligarchs who thought that they could be kingmakers and so forth. And I think the other inflection point came when Putin was already in power. It was the early 2000s. He was going about consolidating his regime, but he viewed cooperation with the United States as a far better alternative to falling under the sway of Beijing. And we had a fairly decent window of time where every time I would go to Moscow, every time, my Russian counterparts would raise this topic of, don't you want to partner with us instead of letting us go the direction we'll then have to go, which is to Beijing. And there was a lot of racism built into it, and the whole 9 yards, a lot of history behind it. And it fell on deaf ears in Washington. Washington would always say, no, the Russians and the Chinese, they hate each other too much for that. These two authoritarian countries, they can never really cooperate and so on. Well, the problem is, be very, very careful what you wish for. Yes, they are both very authoritarian. And in our telling, in Biden's telling, that it is a conflict between democracy and authoritarianism, you just told the Chinese and the Russians that they're on the same side of the barricade.
Let me ask you one more. So I'm going to open up for questions. So we want to make sure that you have a chance to ask Matt questions I'm sure are on your mind. Let me ask one more historical question about things we can't change, but and that's the extent to which, and you've spent a lot of time in Russia. The shock treatment, the rapid move, the belief that you just privatize, the way in which that was executed, the subsequent, really hard economic times and significant drop in average life expectancy. I mean, it was really, how much does that history, does that experience play into what has happened since?
Yeah, I think it plays into still, even 20 plus years later, Putin's ability to say, look at the time when you didn't know where your next paycheck would come from, where you didn't know where you could get medicine for your ailing parents, where you didn't know if the police would protect you because someone's paid them off. That time was under the pro-Western Democrat, Boris Yeltsin. Now look at what you have under me. Yeah, we're fighting the entire West over there in Ukraine. They're just, Nazis, right? They're coming for us, just like they did for our grandfathers. But we'll beat them. But look at what we have at home. We've got, food on the shelves in the grocery stores, despite Western sanctions. We've got order on the streets. You've got light and heat in your homes. And the reality is, Russians could be so much better off. But they've literally never been. So what are they comparing to? Right? They're comparing to their most recent salient memory, which is really bad. So yeah, it's really important.
Yeah. I'm tempted to ask you about the remarkable Nazi propaganda. It's just at some level, you have a Jewish president of Ukraine. How can that even begin to resonate? And yet, it's the central narrative, historical narrative of Russia in a lot of ways. So we'll maybe come back to that. But I do want to open it up. Rob, you have a mic? There we go. Please, we'll get the mic to you. Introduce yourself and try to keep the questions brief, and we'll try to get to as many as we can.
Yeah, and I'll walk around the room. So she had her hand up first.
I'm Ingrid Lusko, and I worked in Yerevan, Armenia in 93, 94. And I also worked with Russian doctors, and they were amazingly proud of their country's history. And they hated Gorbachev for giving the country up. And I think that when it comes to Putin, I think his goal, which is a guess, right? But that he wants to bring all the countries that he lost, the 13 countries that seceded, to bring back Russia, the glorious days of Russia, for his history. What do you think?
Well, again, I don't know what's in his heart. I know what he's said and I know what he's done. So he's done lots of things which sort of stopped short of major territorial conquest. What always surprised me was why take a teeny tiny part of Georgia, right? What, just like if you want to be up there in the pantheon, like you said, you're not even close, right? You're not in Catherine the Great, Peter the Great territory. You're one of the kind of mid-19th century also ran Tsars. And the reality is, with the military force that's at his disposal relative to these tiny, basically unprotected countries, he could do much more, which always made me think that he was fairly sophisticated and content with the idea that, look, you don't have to conquer a country if you can control it by other means. And the guy is a KGB officer, right? He's trained in manipulating and controlling people and systems. And he has no scruples, right? I mean, he really is truly willing to do anything. And that, I think, worked quite a bit. And so I think rather than thinking about his aims as territorial expansion and territorial control, I would think about his aims in terms of regime security, right? And in Russia, that's always meant you need a buffer, right? But the buffer doesn't have to be willy-nilly in any direction, right? You need a buffer against the threats, America, right? And of course, China. But the Chinese buffer for now is managed by the fact that he and Xi Jinping find themselves on the same side. So the last thing the two of them are going to do is fight over territory, even though, by the way, the Chinese claim huge chunks of territory that the Russians currently own. And by the way, there are some vice versa claims, like Harbin in China, which I've been to in northeastern China. It was basically a Russian city. It looks like a Russian city. It's amazing. Anyway, my point is, I think Putin thinks in terms of what he needs to do to stay in power. I think he thinks what he needs to do to have the status that he wants internationally, which basically means not that he can dictate outcomes, but that he can prevent outcomes he doesn't want, a kind of veto power, right? Which ironically, Russia does have under international law, but of course, Russia doesn't always follow international law, and neither do we. That's an aside, but international law would be a nice thing. It'd be really nice if everyone would follow it, and Russia would have a veto, and they'd be very happy about that. And I think the last thing he wants is a compelling narrative, and that's something that emerged over time. And the problem with that narrative is that it has led him into some incredibly stupid things that are now threatening, one and two. One, because his own system is now weaker than it was, and two, because he's become an international pariah.
Joe.
Thank you. You emphasize the difficulties involved in reading Putin's mind. Can you make an effort at reading Prigozhin's mind? After all, I've heard it argued that Prigozhin stopped because all of this was a plot between him and Putin to enhance Putin's power within the state.
So, there are literally limitless conspiracy theories in Russia that are all really fun and interesting, but if I can't see it and I can't touch it, I tend to have trouble working with it as an analyst. So what can I work with? Prigozhin gave an interview 2 months ago to one of these, uber nationalist Russian war bloggers. This is like a thing now, mill bloggers. Like I never even heard that term until the last year and a half. And so this like 20-something Russian blogger is interviewing him and says, well, you guys are doing all the hard fighting, and you guys are like the real warriors in this war, and the MOD is so incompetent because the ultra-nationalist patriot Russians, they want to win the war. They actually agree with what Putin tried to do. They just think he's executed it. Or no one really says the Tsar is wrong. They say the generals have executed it badly. And so they're sort of, he's flattering Prigozhin. He says, why don't you just, roll your tanks to Moscow and show them what's what? Them being the Ministry of Defense, not topple Putin. And Prigozhin, I'm not making this up, his answer is, oh, I hadn't really thought about that, but that's an interesting idea. This was 2 months ago. So do the math, right? I mean, he had 10,000 men. He had some very sophisticated weapons. We know that for sure, both because we saw some of them, but also because he was able to shoot, like roughly 10% of the amount of Russian air power out of the sky as the Ukrainian military had done in the entire last year and a half. Like, he's got some sophisticated stuff if he can do that, and he rolls to within 200 kilometers of Moscow. And yet the fact that he stops is explained about 3 weeks ago by the president of Belarus, who was supposedly part of this negotiation, although I'm very skeptical that he was the driving force. But he always talks too much. He's like Castro. He gives like 4-hour speeches because who's going to turn him off? He's the president. And so he gives all this level of detail that's actually pretty plausible because there's so much detail. Like, how do you make up that much detail? And one of the key details is that one of Prigozhin's contacts from within the Ministry of Defense, possibly Surovikin, who then is later arrested, but we don't know, convinces him, says, look, if you attempt to cross the Oka River, which is 200 kilometers south of Moscow in Tula Oblast, they will fight. And up to that point, Russian interior forces, there aren't Russian military inside of Russia because they're all fighting in Ukraine, but interior security forces, which have, APCs and heavy weapons and so on, they weren't resisting at all. And, like, crossing a river is no small thing. Like, that's been very costly for both the Russians and the Ukrainians. And I think what Prigozhin must have realized, again, I'm trying to, take the bait and read his mind a little bit. What he must have realized is if he loses even half of his 10,000 forces, right? If he's in disarray, or if people see that they can start to attack him, and maybe there are guerrilla attacks or something on the way to Moscow, he's never going to make it to Moscow, and he's a dead man. Whereas, if he does exactly what you're suggesting, which is make it look like to the ordinary person, oh, it's these power games among the powerful, we don't know what happened, there was probably some deal. He still has a krisha, a roof, protecting him somewhere on high. Oh, and by the way, he has 10,000 men who are hardened fighters, and he just retreats back to Ukraine or goes to Belarus or whatever. He has a chance of surviving. So it's the best of bad options, and I think he chose wisely, after choosing very unwisely.
I'm Rob Clinton. My question is, why did Alexei Navalny think it was in his best interest to go back to Russia, number one? And number two, if you care to tell us more about the U.S.-Russia Foundation, what you did before all of these changes and what you're doing now, what your real mission is and your efforts.
Yeah, so on Navalny, I mean, he was asked that question over and over and over, and obviously many people said, you shouldn't do this is what's going to happen, and he was clearly prepared for it. They were filming the entire time. I mean, I watched this live streamed, on Navalny's channel as it was happening. But I think the best answer actually came from another politician who has, for whatever reason, captivated fewer imaginations in the West, Vladimir Kara-Murza, but basically in the exact same situation, was a Russian opposition politician in exile. His family lives in the United States, but he went back in, I want to say, April of 2022. They let him into the country, but within a month or so, he was arrested, and he is now in prison, suffering isolation, all the same stuff like Navalny. And what Kara-Murza said when he was asked, and I was one of those who said to him, like, don't do this, this is not going to end well. He said, I'm a Russian politician. I belong in Russia. And that's really hard to argue with, because if we care about the future in Russia, that's going to have to be made by people. And right now, the Russians in Russia are not making that future. Although, don't dismiss everyone in Russia, right? There are future Navalny's and Gorbachev's and whatever else in today's Russia. And that's a good segue to a question I'm glad you asked about, what does USRF do? I'll give you the short version, which is, in the 1990s, we used to do a lot of that market reform stuff that in some ways went sideways. What I'm proud of, I wasn't part of it at the time, we were an investment fund created by the US government to support, sort of Marshall Plan style, to support the rebuilding of post-Soviet Russia as a free market. What I'm proud of in retrospect is that what USRF did was to invest in small and medium enterprises, and not in oligarch businesses, and not in energy companies, and not in all the massive corruption that later, went right into Putin's coffers. And some of those companies, thrived for a long time, but many of the entrepreneurs we supported are now in exile, along with perhaps as many as 1 million other Russians who fled since February of 2022. And so now, today, and I'm skipping over a ton of stuff in the middle, including when USRF gets kicked out of Russia, and when I get added to the sanctions list and all of this, right now, today, we support those Russians in exile who have chosen to leave Russia, who are working in the fields of civil society and education, rule of law, small and medium enterprises, but with a civic conscience, right, committed to the idea of a future democracy in Russia, and free media, free information. And that last one is worrisome to me, to be quite honest, because I think, again, this prediction's worth what you paid for it, but I think Putin's going to turn off the internet. I think he's going to turn off the internet to the outside world. That's probably one of those kind of, hybrid's not the right word, but one of those sort of sausage slice escalations, one of the things he can do to buy himself a lot of control domestically, and there's not much we can do about it. And we're using the openness of the internet in Russia right now, so why would he let us continue to do that?
Is the administration's actions aimed at giving a message to China as well as to Russia?
Obviously, I'm not a sinologist, but I've had this amazing opportunity. I mean, you'd have to be living in a cave to not realize, like, China's really important. And so for 5 or so years before the pandemic, I was going pretty regularly to China. They were always interested in meeting with American Russia experts, right? Because they wanted to understand how we thought for their own reasons, and we wanted to understand how they thought. So like I said, I've been to Harbin, I've been down to Yunnan, I've been to Xinjiang, which is total no-go zone for Westerners. And luckily, the contacts I've made, I've been able to stay in touch with them in the post-pandemic age through Zoom, right? And I understand, like, what they're saying. I mean, they live in a communist, controlled system. And so what they're saying is designed to be overheard, and it is designed for my consumption as an American and so on. But let me tell you what they're saying, because I think it's really interesting. They are overwhelmingly of the view that Vladimir Putin is a chaos agent, that they do not see the future of China's national interest with what Putin is doing in Europe and what he's doing to Ukraine. Of course, they dismiss out of hand any comparison between Taiwan and Ukraine, and they make this kind of international law argument that they have different statuses and blah, blah, blah. But essentially what they're saying is, look, we benefit from a rules-based international order. Look how rich we've become thanks to this order. We don't want to see it torn down. and were too sophisticated to buy the Russian propaganda narrative, which they have managed to promote in a lot of places around the world, South America, Indian subcontinent, Africa, even parts of Europe, that says if you have a disagreement with an American-led version of the international order, then we have an alternative for you, right? It's zero-sum, though, right? And the Chinese are both powerful enough and sophisticated enough that their message is, we do have a disagreement, but we don't like that version either. We have our own version. We would like to work with you as equals, and that means having our interests respected equally, which is hard for us to do because we've been a hyperpower for a long time, and revise the system. And, you know, I think, again, I got to give credit to this administration. They seem to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. In the last couple of months, they have sent these feelers, you know, Janet Yellen and Tony Blinken going to Beijing and basically saying, like, oh, you have a peace plan? Great. It's a stupid peace plan, but that's a good start, you know? I mean, not making the really dumb, unforced errors of basically telling the Chinese, as I said earlier, you know, there's a barricade between real democracies and authoritarian, evil countries, and you're on that side of the barricade. That we cannot afford to do. And we were doing that for a while, but I think we've course corrected on that.
Except for Biden's dictator slip, but yes.
I'm not going to tell you what people in Washington say about Biden's comments.
Thank you. I'm Gus Burkhardt. Quick question on the grain deal that Putin pulled out of. Why was and is the West so reticent to escort those same ships through the Baltic Sea and the Dardanelles?
I think you mean through the Black Sea, yeah. So it's a fair question, but I would so let me start by clarifying what's going on. The grain deal doesn't prohibit, the absence of a grain deal doesn't prohibit Ukraine from exporting grain. It just means that it has to send it to Romania, and then Romania can ship it out, right? So there are less costly than potentially, you know, creating a major military incident between the West and Russia. There are less costly options to continue to get Ukrainian grain to market. What is actually much more damaging than the absence of a grain agreement, and the grain agreement, like, it's a talking point. It's an important talking point. So when African leaders gather in St. Petersburg this week for the Russia-Africa summit, like, you better believe they're saying, why are you doing this, right? Like, those are our food supplies. We need that grain. But there are still plenty of ways to get Ukrainian grain to market. What's much more damaging is the fact that Russia is actively bombing the Ukrainian grain. So 60,000 tons of food has been destroyed, poisoned by Russian bombing. And the same thing is true of mines that are flooding and destroying groundwater supplies, you know, port facilities that are being taken out, so you can't do exports, right? Russia is essentially, you know, by its, these are not military targets. It's like, I always used to at least give what the Russian Foreign Ministry would communicate the benefit of the doubt that it reflected some kind of internal logical consistency. It is like patently illogical when the Russians accuse the Ukrainians of sending 2 drones towards Moscow, towards the defense ministry, and call that an act of international terrorism on the same day that they are blowing up apartment buildings and grain silos. And that they release photos. They've released photos of, identifiably, of John Deere harvester combine things, like you can tell from the profiles of them. I mean, I'm not doing this, but these mill blogger types will show this, and they've claimed that they're Leopard tanks that their drones are destroying. Well, like, you know, a tank and a combine harvester look really different. One of them has wheels.
Thanks. Jeff Larson, Naval Postgraduate School, former adjunct with Corbell. Matt and I worked together in NATO for a while, a couple years ago.
Jeff was my boss. He's not saying that.
Thanks. It's good to see you again. Thanks for coming to Colorado. So I wanted to ask a question, probably not on the topic you think I would ask, but just about NATO. So we've seen this slow rolling escalation as NATO continues to, with a couple of exceptions, to be more aligned and in consensus about the need to support Ukraine. But do you see a point at which Russia's finally going to be unhappy enough to interfere in some way? I mean, what kind of weaponry or what level of support is going to push Putin over the edge to respond?
So, I mean, it's like the question in a lot of ways. I don't think, I think the last year and a half and the just incredible deftness of mainly the US, right? I think most of the allies are basically following the US lead on this. The Brits to an extent, although I think they're being actually a little bit less deft. I think they're a little more reckless in some ways. This is what happens when you leave the EU and you have to be global Britain, is you have to do things to get attention. So if you notice, the United States is not sending long-range weapons like cruise missiles and things like that, but now the Brits are, right? So they want to try to push the envelope to get attention. I don't think it's smart, but I don't think that things like that are going to cause Putin to declare war on NATO. I think war on NATO right now on the scales is much more threatening to the longevity of his regime than just continuing to accept that NATO is making this war harder for Russia. But by the way, as we talked about, not so much harder that the Russians are retreating back to Russian territory. They're still in Ukraine. So this is an acceptable situation. I think what Putin would care about much, much more is if we actually started to put significant effort behind supporting opposition to his rule from within Russia. And don't get me wrong, I work with Russian opposition, not those guys. Those aren't the guys who are going to topple Vladimir Putin today. It's nasty, dark forces within Russia. And if he got the sense that anyone in the West, and it would be done indirectly through cutouts, because you asked, what do those weapons look like? That's what those weapons look like. It's indirect connections that start to credibly look like the West is planning for Putin's overthrow. That's the red line. And this does get, Jeff, to your field, to nukes. I think to him, the existence of the Russian Federation, which is the red line, right? The use of nuclear weapons is going to happen when the existence of the Russian Federation is threatened. I think to Putin, that's tantamount to his existence of him and his regime. And so that's what we have to be, again, I'm not talking moral terms, I'm talking in practical, strategic terms, very, very careful about signaling. And you've noticed that other than a few slips of the tongue, our leaders are really careful. Really, really careful about how they do that. But there's no way out either. There's no way out. We're going to have to continue to deal with a Kim Jong-un style, international pariah armed with nuclear weapons.
Hi, I'm Alan Grew. I wanted to ask about, we've seen the Russian military fail a lot in Ukraine, as we have been talking about, and I want to know how Russia's performance in that war has changed the way that we're looking at the geostrategic positioning in the Arctic, and if we think Russia's still really viable up there, or how viable they are.
I'm actually really glad that you asked, that you had that last sort of question mark there, Alan, because one easy, unforced error that we could make would be to conclude that because Putin did a badly executed version of an invasion of a massive neighboring European country that didn't want to be occupied, that the Russian security state is a paper tiger. That would be a massive unforced error on our part. It is still an incredibly formidable player. Russia's presence, infrastructure, familiarity, and its interests in the Arctic all make it a major player in the Arctic in security terms, but security translates also to movement of goods, much of which is energy supplies that originate in the Russian Arctic. So unless we're planning to send an expeditionary force and conquer those oil fields, like they're Russian oil fields, so the stuff that people are, because it's not, by the way, people talk about could we ship iPhones from China, over the Northern Passage, or people did a couple of years ago. That doesn't make economic sense, right? You can put that on a train or a plane and it's still economically viable. It's the stuff that originates in the Arctic, right? The metals, the diamonds, the oil, the gas, that's got to get out of it. And that's where the transshipment comes in. And that, like it or not, is going to keep happening, because when Arctic sea ice is on average 40% less than it's ever been, in human memory, the temptation is too great. And even if we're not buying it, China is, India is. So I think we have to take Russia seriously as an Arctic player if we care about the future of an economically, let's say, reasonable approach to Arctic resources and an environmentally sustainable approach to Arctic resources.
My name is Brewster Boyd. My question is this. It's probably an ignorant question, but what do you know have we been able to identify and work with when Putin goes, whether it's cancer, a heart attack, it's assassination, or this is more to life? Are there leaders in Russia that are maybe of a different mindset to some extent? And
Yeah.
They're, whatever you can say as far as connections and.
No, I mean, the answer is of course, yes, of course. Most of what we've said about Putin, while trying to stop short of like having a psychological profile of him, because I think that's pretty hard to do, it's possible, has been pretty personal to him, to his experience, being in supreme power for a quarter century, focusing on regime preservation, but also building this narrative as he's done, someone else, even from within the system, coming to power. We saw this in Soviet times, right? Same ideological upbringing, same system, cadres within the party and so forth, and they can be as, wildly different as, Khrushchev and Gorbachev and Stalin and Brezhnev, radically different people. So I could name a bunch of, Russian governors and security services, apparatchiks at the higher levels who would all be plausible successors. Or I think the most probable is the current prime minister. That's how Putin became president, right? Like Yeltsin resigned, Putin was prime minister. The Constitution says, okay, prime minister becomes president. Not because they care what the Constitution says, but because that's where you put the Dauphin. That's where you put the heir apparent. So, I think people pay close attention to who Putin puts in various positions because they know that, that person might be a heartbeat away. The current prime minister has got his allies in the security services. I mean, he'd be plausible. And I think he would have no desire to continue fighting a losing war. The question is, how does he extricate himself from it? So he'd have to be so secure in power that reversing course by either conceding, right, appearing to lose, or cutting a deal that was a patently unfavorable deal but could be dressed up as something else, wouldn't jeopardize his ability to hold on to power. Or you could have a kamikaze transition figure. You could have someone who takes power and just goes for broke, tries to win the war, tries to regain the favor of the West. I mean, any number of those scenarios are possible. And the last scenario I want to offer you is, let's not forget that it is at times when the Russian people are suffering that there tends to be the most internal tumult, and they are increasingly suffering, though it's nothing like World War I leading to the revolution. But you never know where a revolution is going to go until it's already gone there. And so my concern about something that looks good at first, right, like a democratically minded successor, standing on a tank in a square, and we could imagine something like that, right, is where does it go next, right? And again, Boris Yeltsin picked Vladimir Putin. So my concern is we don't even know, based on the successor, what the succession will actually be.
Let's take one
more
or
question.
most two questions, because I know we stand between you and dinner.
Thank you for sharing your thoughts on all of this. David Skaggs, I'm a recovering politician that actually tried to do what I said I was going to do. Anyway.
I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. I'm used to it. We've enjoyed the moral high ground in this particular situation now for a year and a half. And yet, it's inconceivable to me that when the end game comes, we're going to have to back off some of the morally righteous positions that we've taken. It's a problem we faced before as a country. I'm just wondering, if you were writing the memo for the Secretary of State when that time comes, how do you tell the American people that this is what we've got to do?
First of all, I think you'd be surprised how little the American people will care what the ultimate deal looks like. I think the bigger question for the American people is just how long this lasts. I think it's an attention span thing. I think Americans just got, we were not in the weeds of what was really happening within, the Afghan government 3 elections into post-2001. I think most Americans couldn't have even told you who the president of Afghanistan was at the end. We were tired of it. It just had gone on for so long, and it had appeared to be so costly. So I think it's really timing. It's which administration, right? Which president, which Secretary of State is going to take the responsibility to sponsor some sort of solution here. It's more about timing than it is about content. But I think the harder question that's directly adjacent to that is, how will Ukrainians ever accept a solution that is anything other than what they have been promised by their leaders and what they are owed and what they deserve? And I don't have a great answer to that question. I can tell you that I think part of the equation is going to be more cost for us. I think we in the West are going to have to pay quite a lot to give Ukraine something like a chance at a Germany post-World War II economic, turnaround, or a sort of rebuilding. And the scale of it's going to be the Marshall Plan was about $200 billion in today's dollars, and it's already estimated that reconstruction in Ukraine is getting close to $1 trillion. And the bleeding hasn't stopped, right? I mean, you could build something today, it'd just be destroyed tomorrow. So it's a concern, but it's also, it's a recipe. Money we have money, right? We can actually do this. And by the way, the way that governments think about money, you're in a realm where, in effect, that trillion creates another 10 trillion down the line because you don't have to fight World War III, right? So it's not a crazy idea. The other hard thing is Ukraine's narrative, right? I think a lot of the people who are doing the hardest fighting in Ukraine right now, if we're very honest about it, are not lovey-dovey Democrats. They're not people that you want to see come back to Kiev and run for office and get elected. They're people whose version of the Ukrainian narrative does not include someone like Volodymyr Zelensky, much less Tatars and Russian speakers and so forth. They want a Ukrainian ethno-state. They want to recreate, the glory of historic Ukraine. And I think in line with this comment that my Russian and Ukrainian colleagues both agreed on, which is you have to hate, you need those guys. You need those people to fight right now to have a chance in this war. I'm very worried about what they do after. If there's a settlement, they are going to be the ones who either are going to be in conflict with a civic Ukrainian democracy, right? Or they're just going to take over. And we know where that goes.
Well, what an extraordinarily rich, thoughtful, wide-ranging commentary. Thank you all for the great questions. Join me in thanking Matt Rojanski for a fabulous talk. Thank you so much.
Well, I'll finish things off. Hopefully this microphone's working. Thank you both. Always, Dean Mayer, you do an excellent job with the interrogation, so to speak. And thank you so much, Mr. Rojanski, for all of the insightful knowledge we've gotten tonight. It was eye-opening again, as I seem to always say at these meetings, because there's so much richness that comes out of this. But we thank you so much for being here and for leading the charge here, so to speak. Just so everybody knows, we do have an excellent year ahead. This, as I said at the beginning, is kind of an unusual meeting. It's in the middle of summer. But we've already got most of our speakers scheduled for next year. And there's going to be some surprises, probably all of them. I've been informed, all of them. So all of the speakers have been picked. But we may have some other, what I would call, people that come to town occasionally, so keep watching our newsletters, and I think we've got an excellent lineup. Also, there is a card on some of your chairs that has the lineup, and also we have sent out a survey to people. It should be in your inbox, your email inbox, and if you have time, we'd really appreciate it if you could fill it out. It has a lot of questions about programming, what you'd like to see, what you'd like not to see, and we're really looking for your input. I'm really looking forward to the year ahead. I think all of you should be very excited. I think we've got a tremendous lineup, like speakers like this tonight, and we have a history of doing awesome programs. So without much further ado, I'm going to let you guys go. Have a great evening. Have a great rest of your summer. Thank you.